Okay, so let's talk for a little bit about lecture organization. Let's talk about why we should listen for lecture organization. Let's talk about organizational plans within lectures, and then let's discuss some of the defining features of each. So, why should we listen for organization? Every lecturer in any subject area is going to have a goal in mind for each lecture. So the lecturer may want you to learn a series of definitions, or may want you to be able to visualize something, understand a concept, or understand how something works, okay? And so if you understand the lecturer's goal, it helps you to make predictions about what's upcoming in the lecture, and it also helps you retain information. So within every lecture, there are a series of organizational patterns. But the most important thing to know straight off the bat, which means the first thing it is important to know, is that you don't want to, quote, lose sight of the forest for the trees. That means that don't get stuck on the details before you understand the big picture. Additionally, you want to make sure that you are listening for the organizational framework, because it will help you out immensely to know if and when you've missed a piece of material and need to go back and ask a classmate or ask your professor for help. So let's just talk now about 3 different lecture plans, lecture methods of organization, and those will be defining a term, listing subtopics, and describing causal relationships. So, defining a term. First things first. Sometimes a lecturer's goal is simply to help you define a term, to learn what a thing is. And that can take the form of a simple definition or an extended definition. A simple definition is something like, for example, the biosphere is simply a region of Earth in which organisms can exist. The biosphere is simply a region of Earth in which organisms can exist. So that was a simple definition. I said what I meant. An extended definition expands on the ideas that the simple definition has explained by elaborating in more detail. Just as it sounds, it's extended. So we might say that the biosphere is the area on Earth in which organisms can exist. And then we would extend that definition to say that it extends up to 20,000 feet in altitude. It extends to the bottom of the ocean, and it goes inwards to a limit of 100 feet. All right. So I have given you the simple definition, then I extended it to describe further the thing or the concept that I've already defined. So how do you know that your lecturer is about to launch into defining a term? Well, there are certain keywords and phrases that you can listen for, such as a rhetorical question. Now, what do I mean by X? Now, what do I mean by the biosphere? You could say, how can we define X? How can we define the biosphere? And that's very straightforward. Additionally, you could say something like, when I used biosphere, I meant, and then the definition, you could say, by biosphere, I meant, when I referred to biosphere, I was referring to, and then the explanation, all right? There are so many keywords and phrases that there is no way to memorize them all. And so the takeaway from this is just to be listening for those pieces of language. All right. So very often when an instructor is defining a term, they will write that term on the board as they explain. And this is great because we don't always know how to spell things like biosphere or endogamy, right? So let's take the word biotic. And if I were to write the word biotic on the board, it would be B-I-O-T-I-C, biotic, okay? So if it were me, and you know this from class, I go up to the board and I write it down and I underline it because it's important. And so terms like that can be followed by noun phrase definitions. So let's say we're talking about biotic components, and you go, what does biotic mean? How do I know what a biotic component is? Well, because I would say, these are the biotic components, the living components, okay? So we have that noun phrase definition. Also, you should be listening for the stress and intonation and pauses there. So you might hear, these are the biotic components, the living components. And in doing so, they equate the word biotic with the word living, all right? So noting that stress is important. But what if you're not defining a term? What if you are listing subtopics? Well, sometimes a lecturer's goal is to break down a topic by listing or enumerating a number of its features. So our text has an example about Amnesty International. It's a human rights organization. And let's say a lecturer is explaining Amnesty International, and they want to explain the underlying principles behind their work. So they might say, there are 8 principles underlying Amnesty International's work. The first is, and then they would explain, and that would be your cue. Okay, so there are 8. I know there are 8. I know this is the first. And if by the time this lecture is over, I don't have all 8, I know that I've missed something. And as we discussed, if you missed something, what do? You make a big star on those notes and you talk to your professor later. You talk to a classmate later, all right? So cues to recognize a list is coming are numbers. So you might say the first point is, or the 5th point is. Sometimes people will flat out say number 1 or number 6, first, second, third. When you hear cue words like that, it's very indicative, especially if they've already told you at the beginning there are 8 principles. You know, okay. The indication that listing is about to occur isn't always so straightforward, but the ones that are straightforward are the ones that I like best. So whenever someone is speaking, there will be stress that emphasizes the number. So they'll say, the first principle is, the first principle is, all right? The stress is always on that number. They don't say, the first principle is, right? So that's not to say that stress can be reduced in a number of ways, okay? So I could say, okay, with no emphasis at all, there are 8 principles that underlie Amnesty International's work. Right? No stress at all. There are 8 principles that underlie Amnesty International's work. But what if I said it? There are 8 principles that underlie Amnesty International's work. Well, then the stress is on 8, and you know, oh, I better be taking that list, right? I could say, there are 8 principles that underlie Amnesty International's work, which is to say that I'm emphasizing what they are doing, not the number of them, right? So we practiced this in class together. We practiced taking notes about abiotic factors for life. We worked through an excerpt from a library sciences lecture. We worked through a lecture on memory, a little piece of that. And so if you have questions about that, I recommend going back and looking at that section in your book. What happens, though, if we don't want to define a term and we don't want to list subtopics? We instead want to describe a causal relationship. So when I say when I say describing a causal relationship, it sounds much more technical than it is. All that means is that the lecture pattern might include some combination of the following. So It might be a description of a problem, and then, and or the circumstances surrounding an event, okay? And then the causes of or reasons for that problem or those circumstances. It might be the effects of that problem or those circumstances, or it could include the solutions to a problem. All right. So if we are talking about acid rain, and that's our topic, and I want to use a causal relationship lecture pattern, I might say something to the effect of acid rain. Acid rain destroys structures, both natural and man-made. It harms the environment in numerous ways. But what causes acid rain? Well, one of the leading causes of acid rain was auto emissions. Additionally, industrial emissions. All right, so you had your topic, you had your effect, what acid rain does, and then you had your cause. Well, what causes that? I used very straightforward language. As a side note, acid rain was a much bigger problem. Gosh, how old I have been? Well, regardless, it's one of those situations where the world came together and did something good, and now acid rain is not as big of a situation as it was even 15, 20 years ago. In any case, cues to recognize causal relationship lecture patterns include words and phrases such as due to the fact that. If someone says due to the fact that, they're about to tell you why. Because, since. If you have conditional sentences, those if-then sentences, this is due to, which sounds very similar to due to the fact that. They mean basically the same thing. You could say, it has nothing to do with X, but rather, and then explain. You could use words like thus, therefore, consequently, for these reasons, and those words and phrases signal that you're about to talk about the effect of a previously stated event. Okay. Rhetorical questions, as always, rhetorical questions have so many uses, and this is one of them. So you might say, acid rain. It's bad, right? But how can we explain this? How can we explain this phenomenon? Okay, so there's your cue phrase. Acid rain is destroying national monuments. How did we get to this point? How did we get to this point, right? Acid rain harms the environment. Why is this the case? So let's say that we are talking about the result of stress on the body, the results of stress on the body. And I want to explain that extended periods of stress can have detrimental effects on the human body to the tune of, and then I start listing, the alteration of sleep patterns and hormonal disruptions and all those sort of negative things of that nature. So I have my topic, and then I have the result, and then I want to say, but why does stress have such a profound impact on the human body? And that would be the clue that I was going into an explanation of the cause in a causal relationship lecture pattern. Cool.